standard photo. We have to. What? Abby will guard your remarks.
Yes, I will.
But you were fabulous.
I'm Bruce Holman. Hi, we've never met.
Oh, great to meet you. Thanks for doing this.
My pleasure.
indeed.
Wonderful. Really, thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, my pleasure. It's great to be here.
Yeah, great, lovely.
The first lecture was fascinating yesterday. It was great. I told them it was real history. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. And many of you were here yesterday at the Hiphop Archive for the first lecture. I learned so much. And it's so interesting to me because Professor Badger started in 1933. And I just finished a book that ends in 1915, which is about the rise and fall of Reconstruction and then the rollback to Reconstruction. It's kind of a mirror to, well, what can you say? 8 years of black freedom followed by an alt-right rollback. What's that sound like? And this is the period immediately, and I am in 1915 because that's when Birth of a Nation is aired, the most racist film in history of the United States, probably. And that people forget and think it's a film about the Civil War, but it's not. It's a film about Reconstruction. So it's fascinating. I learned just so much, and I'm so honored to host you, and that you showed up, as we say. It's going to be a marvelous book. So with that, I refer to my friend Bruce, who's now introduced us.
Well, welcome, everybody. Thank you, Professor Gates. It's a great honor for me to be here to introduce my colleague and friend, Tony Badger. I will try to be brief, but it will be hard. For those of you who were here yesterday, you will recall Professor Badger's story about the 1938 congressional campaign of Al Gore Sr., one of his many subjects, in which he was trying to give a speech about reciprocal trade agreements, and yet members of his band came forward holding Gore's fiddle over their head and insisted that he play the fiddle instead, and he eventually gave it and they brought the house down. I am aware that I am the speech on reciprocal trade agreements and he is the fiddle, so I won't get this way. So as I'm sure most of you know, Tony Badger is professor in American history at Northumbria University and the Emeritus Paul Mellon Professor of American History and Emeritus Master of Clare College at Cambridge. He is, I'm sure, well known to this audience as the leading historian of the New Deal, as well as a prominent historian of the development of the modern American South and of modern U.S. political history in general. His books include Prosperity Road, The New Deal Tobacco in North Carolina, The New Deal, The Depression Years, 1933 to 1940, and FDR, The First 100 Days. His latest book, a biography of Albert Gore Sr., is due out sometime later next month. Less well known, perhaps, than those achievements that dot his CV are Tony's expertise in the field of NCAA college basketball, an expertise he developed during his sojourn in North Carolina, and also his leading role as, I would say, playing the leading role in advancing the study of U.S. history in Great Britain, a set of accomplishments that includes training an impressive number of doctoral students who have become major scholars in their own right, and the establishment of numerous initiatives to promote transatlantic scholarly cooperation, some of which I have been a beneficiary of myself. This evening, in the second of the 3 Huggins lectures making up Why White Liberals Fail, Southern Politicians and Race, 1933 to 2018, Professor Badger will turn our attention to the post-World War II period. His subject for today is Brown, Silent Acquiescence.
I'm very grateful to my old friend Bruce for that generous introduction. One of the most fruitful collaborations, indeed, that I managed to be involved in while I was in Cambridge was a link-up between Boston University and Princeton in a colloquium on modern American political history. And we all look forward to Bruce's volume in the Oxford History of America, which will go up to 1920. We'll carry Skip's story a little bit further forward. The rabid racism of staunch New Dealer Theodore the Man Bilbo was unleashed in its most virulent form during World War II. The future of the white race, he thundered, had been put in mortal peril by African-American troops and by federal attempts to interfere on behalf of blacks, both in the workplace and in the military. When Bilbo ran for re-election in 1946, he was now supported by the Delta planters who had previously despised him. Their perception of the racial threat was the same as his. 1946, said the Memphis Commercial Appeal, which covered the Delta, 1946 was the first big year of the Negro issue, and Bilbo was unbeatable. Mississippi whites faced the prospect of courageous African Americans like Medgar and Charles Evers, who had both served in the military, attempting to vote on their return to Mississippi. Bilbo told his audiences the best time to keep a nigger away from a white primary in Mississippi was to see him the night before. He urged every red-blooded Anglo-Saxon man in Mississippi to resort to any means to keep hundreds of Negroes from the polls in the primary. And if you don't know what that means, you're just not up to your persuasive measures. The brazenness of this invitation to his audiences to beat up or to lynch potential African-American voters aroused even the United States Senate, now controlled by the Republicans, and it aroused them to consider the legitimacy of Bilbo's election. A remarkable delegation, courageous delegation of Mississippi African-Americans was prepared to go to Washington to give evidence at the hearings of the election subcommittee on the intimidation that they had faced in Mississippi. The Senate was also exploring charges that Bilbo had corruptly received gifts from a defense contractor. What would happen if Bilbo was unseated by the Senate? Circuit Court Judge John Stennis from Kemper, Mississippi, went to see Governor Fielding Wright to see who would be appointed in Bilbo's place. Wright told Stennis that if Bilbo was unseated for corruption, Wright would name Stennis. If he was unseated for disfranchisement, the governor would reappoint Bilbo. Bilbo's death from cancer in 1947 settled this dilemma. Stennis, who had made passionate speeches supporting the United Nations, ran for the open seat and eschewed the rabble-rousing of his 5 opponents in the special election. He explained, "I asked my father what I should say about the race problem. He said, nothing. And that is just what I am doing." Stennis won comfortably, and he would go on, of course, to serve in the Senate for the next 40 years. That fall, Mississippians elected the youngest legislature in the state's history, full of white veterans from World War II, quote, who went to Jackson to make the world a better place. One of those veterans, Frank E. Smith, Stennis's legislative assistant, was elected to Congress in 1950. The only white liberal elected to Congress from the Black Belt South in the post-war years. Now, that same year, newspaperman Hodding Carter, editor of the Delta Democrat Times in Greenville, Mississippi, one of the handful of Mississippi newspaper editors who could be described as a racial moderate, he explained the South to audiences in the North. Carter had already won the Pulitzer Prize for his editorials on racial, religious, and economic intolerance. When Carter won the prize, Bilbo had denounced him. No red-blooded Southerner worthy of the name would accept to pulverize a prize given by a bunch of nigger-loving, Yankeefied communists for editorials advocating mongrelization of the race. Well, in analyzing the South for a national audience, Carter explained the South's fixation with the threat of social equality. He explained that what a white Southerner meant by social equality was sexual equality. A white Southerner's fear, he said, was not likely to be modified by new laws or the repeal of old ones. Carter warned the North that, quote, any abrupt federal effort to end segregation, as it is practiced in the South today, would not only be foredoomed for failure, but would also dangerously impair the present progressive adjustment between the races. What could be hoped for, he said, was gradual racial change, a more rapid amelioration of the discriminatory aspects of the white-Negro relationship. He was encouraged by the fact that, quote, discrimination is diminishing in scope, direction, and intensity throughout the South, partly because of national pressures and the new militancy of the Negro, and partly because of an awakening Southern conscience. Carter was certain that Negroes themselves did not want the end of segregation. He cited Savannah, Georgia, as an example of what African Americans could attain as citizens of the South. Savannah was not paradise, but he argued, quote, that it offers proof that separation and subjugation need not go hand in hand. African Americans voted freely. A rapidly expanding black and middle class, black middle and business class thrived professionally. There were African American policemen and mail carriers. He said parks, schools, and playgrounds were more nearly equal than anywhere else in the South. Here was the classic exposition of the white Southern liberal position. In short, there needed to be change in race relations, but the change needed to be gradual. Liberals knew what African Americans wanted. African Americans wanted to maintain segregation. Federal intervention from outside would be counterproductive. 10 years later, his son, Huggins Carter III, who succeeded his father as editor of the Delta Democrat Times, Huggins Carter III was writing a very different book called The South Strikes Back, which chronicled the rise of the White Citizens Council. The council, he said, stands virtually unquestioned in its dominance of the white community in Mississippi. As the most powerful figure in the Mississippi legislature expounded, the councils represented the greatest forces we have in this battle to save the white race from amalgamation, mongrelization, and destruction. Carter cited the beleaguered position of Hazel Brannon Smith, a friend and admirer of John Stennis, a fervent supporter of the Dixiecrats in 1948. But her editorials protesting police brutality in Holmes County, Mississippi, had led to a Citizens Council boycott of her newspaper and the establishment of a rival paper designed to put her out of business. Today, she said, we live in fear in Holmes County in Mississippi. It hangs like a dark cloud over us, dominating every facet of public and private life. None speaks freely without fear of being misunderstood. Almost every man and woman is afraid to try to do anything to promote goodwill and harmony between the races, afraid he or she will be taken as a mixer or an integrationist, or worse, if there is anything worse by Southern standards. I am not an integrationist, have not been, and never expect to be. So from his perspective, in 1959, Huggins Carter III looked back to the immediate post-war years that his father had written about. Those post-war years now look to the son as, quote, a halcyon period for the exponents of gradualism in the handling of the South's racial problems. And it's a judgment that was echoed much later by that fine journalist and historian John Egerton. In retrospect, Egerton came to see how favorable conditions were for substantive social change in the 4 or 5 years right after World War II. It appears to have been the last and best time, perhaps the only time, when the South might have moved boldly and decisively to heal itself voluntarily. Well, what had gone wrong? Well, the easy answer, of course, is that the Brown decision was responsible. The 1954 Supreme Court decision appeared to be everything that Southern moderates did not want: an outside body mandating immediate racial change and eliminating segregation. The decision produced the backlash of outraged white popular sentiment that racial moderates had always warned against. According to historian Michael Klarman, the backlash swept away liberal and racially moderate politicians. It halted, quote, the incipient amelioration of Jim Crow practices that had been occurring much of the South in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Linked to this argument are the arguments that downplay the importance of, or indeed are critical of, the Brown decision. that it was not as important as long-term social and economic development of the South in securing racial change, that it was not as important as executive action or legislation in actually desegregating schools. School education, and I think this is probably the most powerful of these arguments, was the wrong target for the civil rights movement. It was an area white Southerners would defend most passionately. And if you want an explication of that argument about education not being the right target for the decision, one should read Hannah Arendt, who was very critical of the decision of the NAACP to target school education. Far better to have concentrated on economic issues or voting rights. And indeed, there was a class-based civil rights movement of African Americans and left-led trade unions after the war focused on those two issues. And the argument goes that would have been a better model for a civil rights movement than the cross-class, church-based civil rights movement of Dr. King. Well, I want to argue in contrast, yes, there was a liberal window of opportunity in the late 1940s, but that the liberals did not present a coherent way forward for gradual racial change. That moderate politicians did not actually dominate Southern politics. There were alternative forces at least as strong before the Brown decision, if not stronger, opening not a liberal window of opportunity, but a conservative window of opportunity, part of that long, massive resistance that I was talking about yesterday. And that there was a white backlash in the South before the Brown decision. It wasn't the Brown decision which triggered backlash. The backlash indicated that voting rights and economics were not somehow safer targets than education in any case. First, that there was a liberal window of opportunity in what I have called the first post-war system of biracial politics. There was a small but slowly increasing African American electorate. By 1952, 20% of the voting age African Americans were registered to vote. It resulted from the wartime NAACP voter registration drives and from the Supreme Court decision of 1944 outlawing the white primary. Just as the war had increased African American expectations, so it had opened the minds of many white GIs. As future Governor William Winter recalled, training African American troops in Alabama brought home to him, quote, "How unreal was the world in which I had grown up in Mississippi. When the troops confronted segregation in neighboring Anniston, it, quote, bothered a lot of us who were Southerners, that there was this barrier, this artificial barrier that somehow had been arbitrarily placed on us." Many returning GIs were determined to challenge the older leaders who were so entrenched in narrow-minded cliques in the county seats. There were GI revolts right across the South. As Stuart Long recalled in Texas, the kids came home with a feeling, by golly, we've saved democracy. Now let's make it work at home. Long said there were 85 to 90 veterans in the newly elected Texas House, imbued, Long said, with, quote, youthful idealism, which is another name for liberalism. Even a conservative congressman like Bosch Crump's henchman Cliff Davis in Memphis wrote to his neighboring representative, Tom Murray, "I think you and I must recognize that these students coming out of the colleges, many men who have returned from the war, have more flexible ideas about a lot of things than your generation and mine. I do not care enough about this office to go off in the deep end on a lot of this stuff, but I believe a change here and there may be helpful and certainly will not destroy our ideals and respect for the fundamentals of government." I should note that the person who he wrote to completely disagreed. The GI revolts were campaigns, as often as not, against local corruption. Southern women enthusiastically joined the anti-corruption crusade and to challenge local political bosses. They were particularly prominent in Chet Morrison's campaign for mayor of New Orleans, marching through the streets with buckets to clean up the local mess. Women did not simply return to traditional domestic roles after 1945. The League of Women Voters drew on the New Deal network of women and women's welfare experience in the 1930s to educate Southern women about the challenges facing the post-war South. Estes Kefauver in Tennessee turned to Martha Ragland of the League of Women Voters to spearhead his campaign against the machine rule of Boss Crump. He was the first candidate in the South to appoint women campaign managers in every county. Women were the mainstay of interracial church groups across the South. Later, they would be the driving forces behind the campaigns to keep the public schools open. Organised labour was also more actively engaged in Southern politics, 1944 to 1951, than at any other time in the region's history. Unions were buoyed by successes in negotiating union contracts and wage gains during World War II, when employers had been anxious to maintain full and uninterrupted production and therefore prepared to make concessions. The CIO-PAC launched Operation Dixie to try and capitalize on that success and organize the region. The region, after all, was traditionally a bastion of the open shop. The unions were very conscious industries were trying to relocate there. Therefore, it was important nationally for unions to organize the South. Left-led unions in the CIO organized workers on an interracial basis in cities like Memphis and Winston-Salem. For the CIO-PAC, working rights and economics went together. Unions needed sympathetic local elected officials. They needed governors who would not use the National Guard to break strikes, and they needed legislators who would protect the unions by preventing the enactment of right-to-work laws. Candidates who appealed to these groups got elected in the 1940s and early 1950s. A succession of Southern politicians put together a coalition of lower-income whites and African Americans, a cross-race but lower-income class coalition. William Fulbright, John Sparkman, Estes Kefauver, and Albert Gore went from the House to the Senate. Carl Elliott and Robert Jones helped make the Alabama congressional delegation, of all delegations, comfortably the most liberal congressional delegation in the South. What was most striking, given the structural conservatism of state politics in the region, was the election of 4 liberal governors: Sid McMath, Carl Scott, Jim Folsom, and Earl Long. They all espoused a common man appeal and fought vigorous personal campaigns excoriating the entrenched interests in their states. In a more prosperous South, they could afford to promise their constituents the services that had so long been denied to them by their conservative limited government elites. McMath built more roads than all previous administrations put together. They invested in education, both school building and increasing teachers' salaries. They championed cheap electric power and rural electrification cooperatives. They invested in water resource development, crucial to attracting industry to their states. Roads may seem unexciting, but McMath was 10 years old before he came across a paved road. Jim Hunt, who later served 4 terms as governor of North Carolina, recalled the time in 1950 that graders in his home paved NC 42, the road that ran by his parents' farm, and they paved as a part of Carl Scott's road building program. As Hunt reminded listeners many, many years later, when you lived on a dirt road, as I did, probably the biggest things that could happen in your life is to get a paved road. I remember people who used to get stuck in the middle of the dirt road. The mud was so bad. The dust in the summer, when everything was dry, you couldn't keep the washing out on the lines. We didn't have dryers in those days. Country people would just give their right arm to have their roads paved. I stood at the end of the driveway and watched the road paving machines come along and pave my country road. It just hit me. If you work in politics, you can do wonderful things to help people, tangible things that people really need and want. The governors saw the federal government as the solution to the region's problems, where, of course, conservatives saw it as the problem. They supported federal aid to education, federal development of water resources, and hospital construction. They appointed women to state boards and to state judgeships. But this was not just another business progressivism strategy. They sought to modernize their states from the bottom up. This involved increasing pensions, increasing unemployment compensation, refusing to use the National Guard to break strikes. This strategy put them on a collision course with state bankers, with the powerful private utilities, and with employers. They were a remarkable cast of characters, and as my wife, of course, warned me, as I said last night, not to tell anecdotes in front of such a sophisticated audience. But after I met you last night, I thought, what the hell? McMath's wife famously shot and killed McMath's drunken and violent father. Opponents played records of pistol-packing Mama at campaign rallies. Stories of Jim Folsom's drinking are legendary. My favourite concerns the visit of the British ambassador to the governor's mansion in Montgomery. Lord Inverchapel was greeted at the mansion by a barefoot aide who explained it was customary to go barefoot in the presence of the governor of Alabama. Inverchapel dutifully took off his shoes and socks and made polite conversation awaiting Folsom's arrival. He heard a bellow as Folsom tumbled down the stairs trying to put on his shoes and socks. "Where's this goddamn limey? Let's get him fed out of here." At this point, Inverchapel had this look on his face like his feet had just gone cold. During dinner, Folsom leaned back in his chair and upset the whole table, pouring food all over Inverchapel. When asked what he thought about Folsom, Inverchapel diplomatically replied, "The governor is one of the most interesting men I have ever met." Those of you who know the film Blaze, in which Paul Newman is somewhat incongruously cast as Earl Long, will know that Long had a well-publicized affair with a French Quarter stripper. He had a mental breakdown when opponents tried to purge African-American voters from the voting rolls. He addressed the state legislature incoherently, swigging whiskey from a Coke bottle. His family stripped him down into a bed in the governor's mansion and sent him to a mental hospital in Texas. There he sought a writ of habeas corpus, and so they allowed him to come back to Baton Rouge, but immediately then committed him to the state mental hospital. There, he used his power as governor to fire the superintendent of the hospital and the board of trustees, and to install a replacement who declared him sane. But where did these liberal governors stand on race? These governors protected the rights of African Americans to vote. Famously, in his last act in office, Earl Long handed over voting records to the United States Commission on Civil Rights. As he told the executive secretary, "You're here to help niggers vote, and I'm for you because they're my niggers, and I want their votes. Now, we're never going to talk about my helping you, but I'm going to get my state registrar to give you the records that you need. And after you talk to him, you remember you never saw me." The governors increased spending on black institutions, notably schools. They appointed the first African Americans to state boards, notably state boards of education. They maintained open lines of communication with black leaders. Their state universities quietly admitted African Americans to graduate school during their time in office. Long supervised the desegregation of the Louisiana State University campus at New Orleans and the integration of New Orleans buses. Long and Folsom both warned of the futility of defying the Supreme Court. It was, they said, the 1950s, not 1860s. Now, they said, the feds have the nuclear bomb. What are you going to do about it? During the Montgomery bus boycott, Folsom met and advised Martin Luther King, met him and advised him to go for the full-scale desegregation of the buses, rather than the separate but equal first-come, first-served demand that the boycott leaders had called for at the start. Carr Scott appointed the most advanced racial liberal in the state, Chapel Hill President Frank Graham, to the Senate in 1949, and he ran for re-election in 1950. These governors opposed the Dixiecrats and they developed close ties to Harry Truman. But they had no plan for gradual racial change that might have preempted federal intervention. There was a plan, the Arkansas Plan, the product of two liberal Arkansas congressmen, sort of encouraged by Fulbright, more encouraged by Harry Ashmore, the editor in Little Rock. The Arkansas Plan was a plan for a regional compromise on race. The plan called for the federal government to back off, and in turn the South would put its own house in order on black education and on law enforcement. The plan failed to gain any traction either in the North or in the South. Southern liberals may have espoused the necessity for gradual racial change, but they did little in the run-up to the Brown decision to lay out a strategy for achieving that gradual racial change. And one reason, as we talked about last night, for that failure is that they were largely shielded from the impatience of African Americans. They tended to hear from racial diplomats, from African American college presidents, for example, who tended to tell white politicians what they wanted to hear. Few liberal politicians campaigned directly for the African American vote. Rather, they relied on intermediaries in the African American community to deliver that black vote. Jim Folsom relied on his chauffeur, Carr Scott relied on a funeral director in Winston-Salem, and the janitor at East Carolina University. In oral history interviews, Sid McMath could not remember the names of the black leaders he dealt with. It was a rare white Southern politician who actually campaigned in black churches or in the black community in the 1950s. Hale Boggs in New Orleans was an exception. He knew that he had to have African American support and white working class voters together to compensate for the loss of silk stocking support that he had lost when his district was redistricted. In Miami, Dante Fascell told me that he remembered that he was the first politician to campaign for the African American vote in daylight. As a result, liberal politicians were all too aware of the passion of some of their white constituents, but they were largely unaware of the impatience of their African American voters. Harding Carter III summed up this moderate ineffectiveness. The one group which might have best used this temporary lull was the most inactive, the most silent body of all. Suddenly, when a need arose for some kind of middle ground action, there was none. Well, was there an incipient amelioration of race relations in the years before the Brown decision? What Harding Carter described in Savannah was undoubtedly accurate. But Savannah and Mobile were coastal cities with a far softer history of race relations than the rest of the South. Elsewhere in the South, by 1950, in city after city, biracial committees that had been set up immediately after the war to improve services in black communities, those committees had disappeared. African-American policemen were confined to black sections of town and usually did not have the power to arrest whites. In progressive cities like Greensboro and Little Rock, black employment opportunities simply did not exist for African-American graduates, college graduates. In Little Rock, the public libraries quietly desegregated, but public facilities scarcely improved. The new park for African Americans was built, quote, out of the city in an insect-infested mountain. But that was in the Upper South. In the Deep South, even that degree of change was not even on the horizon before the Brown decision. The only coherent strategy for racial change was one that emerged, was a conservative one. In Mississippi and South Carolina, leaders embarked on a massive school equalization drive as a way of forestalling the demand for black school desegregation. When South Carolina leaders were faced with the Clarendon County the Briggs case that will ultimately get decided in Brown, Fritz Hollings went down to look at education in that part of South Carolina, in the Black Belt. Jimmy Burns sent down his preeminent advisor, who was going to advise on the strategy in the case, And they both came back and told Burns, we've been down to Clarendon County, South Carolina. We don't have a leg to stand on. These schools there could not possibly be described as fulfilling separate but equal. Burns persuaded the General Assembly in South Carolina to levy a 3% sales tax to pay for a massive school building campaign in black communities. He hoped that would satisfy the federal courts, and indeed in that case it did initially. Later he hoped it would satisfy the Supreme Court, and it was he who recruited the legendary lawyer John W. Davis to argue the Southern case. Mississippi embarked on the same path, although the legislature was clearly going to balk at the sheer scale of spending involved. What the moves in South Carolina and Mississippi confirmed was that moderates were not in control of the region's politics before Brown. In other words, they weren't going to be eliminated by Brown because they weren't in control beforehand. At every point, conservatives usually successfully contested the moderate position. For every liberal espousing a common man appeal, there were successful race-baiting campaigns for governor by Human Talmadge in Georgia, for example. For every returning white veteran who advocated racial change, there were war heroes like Strom Thurmond in South Carolina arguing for progressive change, but also maintaining, as we were talking yesterday, that they had fought to defend democracy, that is, states' rights and segregation. For all the women on interracial church groups, there were conservative women mobilized to defend their homes and their schools. Organized labor found itself defeated time after time in the South by red-baiting drives against local strikes, by state right-to-work laws, and by the reluctance of Southern workers to risk their newfound affluence. When that great Mississippi legislature of young vets met in 1948, they immediately were challenged by the governor, Fielding Wright, to devote their resources not to changing Mississippi, but to denounce the President Truman's civil rights proposals and to support a third-party challenge to the National Democrats. That would be the Dixiecrats. As soon as John Stennis got to the Senate, he became the linchpin of the legalistic efforts in the Senate to thwart the courts and the federal government on desegregation, a campaign that would last for 30 years. The courtly Stennis and the crude Senator Eastland could not have differed more in style, but in civil rights policies, they walked in lockstep. If you'll forgive me, I want to tell my favorite Eastland story, told to me by John Culver, the senator who was, those of you who met Paul Kirk last night, he knew John Culver, who was a close friend of Ted Kennedy's, very well. And Culver said that in 1971, when Nixon appointed Lewis Powell to the Supreme Court, they were worried that the Judiciary Committee, controlled by the Democrats and by the chairman, Eastland, would turn down Powell's nomination. So they sent Mac Mathias from Maryland and went off with Powell to meet Eastland. Powell was a very lean, ascetic, elegant figure. And he went into Eastland's office, and there was this crumpled, tubby, a white Southerner in galluses with his feet up on the desk, smoking a big fat cigar. And Eastland said to Powell, I suppose you want to know if the Democrats on the Judiciary Committee are going to vote to confirm you for the Supreme Court. And Powell said, well, yes, Mr. Chairman, yes. And Eastland went on, the Democrats on the committee are going to vote to confirm you. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do you want to know why they're going to vote to confirm you? Well, Mr. Chairman, I hope it's because I'm well qualified, etc., etc. No, said Eastland. We're going to vote to confirm you because we think you're going to die. White Southerners who told the Gallup poll in 1937 that they would support a liberal party rather than a conservative one, and by a very large margin, now indicated by almost equally a large margin that they would support a conservative option. Frank Graham and Claude Pepper in 1950 may have been red-baited when they ran for re-election, but all the analyses confirmed it was their racial liberalism that was the most important factor that led to their defeats. There was clearly, therefore, a backlash in the South before the Brown decision. In Georgia, South Carolina, and Mississippi, there was a reign of terror at the end of the war that was directed at African Americans who tried to vote. Southern conservatives indeed indicated that it was the prospect of blacks voting that really alarmed them, not the desegregation of Southern schools. John Stennis in Mississippi said quite clearly it was black voters that he was scared of. In Alabama, the key figure in the Citizens Council, planter Sam Engelhardt, frankly admitted that black voting posed him more of a threat than school desegregation. What would happen to his land and wealth if African Americans voted and black tax assessors targeted his property? He warned. So the economics and voting rights were simply not going to be the soft targets that people have argued they would have been. And the furore that consistently developed against the FUPC during these years amply confirmed that. The Brown decision didn't immediately sweep liberals and moderates aside. Jim Folsom's most successful session of the Alabama state legislature was in 1955. Earl Long was elected to another term that year. Carr Scott avenged Frank Graham's defeat by winning a Senate seat in 1954, only days after the Brown decision. But the Brown decision did expose the weakness of Southern liberal politicians and the bankruptcy of their policy strategies. The key to understanding the dynamics of the Brown decision in Southern politics is to recognize that both conservatives and liberals believed that white public opinion supported the other side. Segregationists believed that too many white Southerners were wavering in their commitment to segregation, that too many were resigned to accept the inevitability of racial change. Liberals believed the opposite, that all too many white Southerners were stirred up and implacable in their defense of segregation. Difference was that conservatives were prepared to mount a righteous crusade to stir up white sentiment and to coerce wavering Southerners into line. Liberals and moderates were not prepared to take their case to the people for fear of awakening that racist sentiment. They might expose gradual racial change, but as I said, they were not prepared to campaign for it at the time. They were fatalistic, as if silence meant that desegregation would somehow slip in without anybody noticing it. They never campaigned for or offered a coherent strategy for racial change other than trying to prevent the complete abolition of the public school system and supporting token desegregation if and when federal courts eventually ordered it. In the immediate aftermath of Brown, the first segregationist political response was to attempt to sign up black leaders to support the equalization strategy and to indicate their preference for the continuation of segregated schools. Whether you're in Mississippi or in South Carolina or in North Carolina, leaders were astonished and felt betrayed when African American leaders indicated that they actually wanted the desegregation decision implemented. The second response was to establish commissions that would recommend how to handle the ramifications of Brown. And the Supreme Court gave them a lot of leeway in the implementation decision in 1955, which did not lay down a timetable for the implementation of desegregation. Conservative political leaders were convinced that Klan-style violence would be counterproductive. So instead, they organized the respectable citizens' councils to make the case for segregation. They claimed to eschew violence, but there was a narrow line between the economic intimidation of likely black plaintiffs, publicity, evictions, the withdrawal of credit, and the physical coercion of African Americans. What the council was determined to do was to eliminate dissent in the white community. That is where the bulk of their propaganda and economic and social pressure was directed. In states like Mississippi and Alabama, that coercion of white dissenters was brutally effective. As John Stennis candidly admitted to Mississippi Governor James P. Coleman, we shall have to just use some common sense coercion. Where there was dissent amongst segregationist leaders was the best way to maintain maximum segregation. Some advocated complete defiance. Others, like James Coleman of Mississippi, the governor, argued for, quote, smart segregation, the establishment of a thicket of legal defenses that would make school desegregation impracticable for the foreseeable future. And in the winter of 1956, the South passes a barrage of anti-desegregation laws aimed to achieve that. They were prepared to contemplate the abolition of the school systems. They were prepared to mandate that schools should close rather than desegregate. To complement local state action, Southern senators drafted the Southern Manifesto in 1956 that denounced the Brown decision and promised to defy it by all lawful means. As William Fulbright's aides pointed out to him, even if it was after it was modified, the manifesto said outright, stop. It didn't say delay. It aimed to bring any doubtful Southern senators into line and to warn off the North and the Supreme Court from further measures to implement Brown. The Citizens' Council propaganda and the manifesto, to a large extent, attained their goals. All but 3 Southern senators and all but a handful of Southern representatives signed the manifesto. The behaviour of the court over the next few years, the reluctance to take up school desegregation cases, except in the most flagrant cases, the defiance, testified to the impact of the manifesto and the barrage of anti-court legislative proposals put before the Congress after 1956. As for Southern Liberal politicians, most ran for cover. They hastened to join the Citizens' Council and to sign the manifesto. They became, in Hodding Carter's words, closet moderates. Those moderates who held out were in themselves rather disingenuous in their arguments. Most had avoided commenting on the Brown decision wherever possible. They argued that it was the law of the land, but indicated that, to their relief, it was a state and local matter, not a matter for Congress. When they were forced to take a stand, either about proposals to close the schools or by the manifesto, they contented themselves that it was a matter best sorted out by men and women of goodwill at the local level. Lyndon Johnson, Albert Gore, and Estes Kefauver failed to speculate what would happen if local men and women of goodwill were unwilling to comply with the courts. William Winter, in 1956, summed up this moderate strategy in Mississippi to confront massive resistance. The least said about the problem, he said, the better off everyone concerned will be. Surely there are more important issues, he said a few years later. It just makes me sick to contemplate how much time and energy and attention is consumed on the race question because of the emotional and frenzied efforts on both sides, with the result that our attention tends to be diverted here in this most critical era of history when it is evident that the survival of civilization is at stake. Was there an alternative, plausible, moderate strategy? Well, of course, eventually the massive resistance backed down in face of a determined federal judiciary and the federal government. Conceivably, Eisenhower, who enjoyed enormous popularity in the South as a military hero, and especially amongst Southern businessmen, could have made it clear that the South would have to comply with Brown. The Liberal case would have been much easier to make then. But Liberals were hoist with their own petard, as we discussed yesterday. They had warned for so long about the dangers of outside intervention that leaders outside the region took them at their word. And it made their own case much less convincing. The irrelevance of moderates was highlighted in the great racial confrontations at Little Rock and Old Miss. At Little Rock, the school board and the business leadership worked hard to limit severely the number of African-American children who would go to an integrated school. They then waited to build a new suburban high school to fulfill the needs of white middle-class children. As in New Orleans 3 years later, they allowed the burden of desegregation to fall on white working-class parents. They made no effort to build up community sentiment amongst, for example, the parents at Central High in order to accept desegregation. It was as if school desegregation would occur and nobody would notice. As Sid McMath acknowledged, he and other Little Rock leaders failed to realize until too late that Auburn Forbes was embarked on a collision course with the federal government. For his part, Forbes felt abandoned by the Little Rock leaders. If they weren't prepared to mobilize support for compliance, why should he? McMath's contribution to the Little Rock crisis was a futile effort to get Fulbright to issue a statement urging compliance with the law, and a last-minute plea to Vice President Nixon to use federal marshals, not troops, to enforce the decision. As for the business community, they made almost no effort in the year that Central High was open to support the beleaguered teachers who were trying to make integration work. Only when Forbes closed the schools and outside investment in Little Rock dried up did the business community mobilize to support the school board in reopening the school. Only then did the Chamber of Commerce send spokesmen around the South, warning businessmen of the cost of mob violence and school closures and the cost of following the Little Rock path of defiance. What was striking about the business leadership in these years, was the strength of the business conviction that they could have both economic growth and maintain segregation. It was striking how much disorder they would tolerate before they decided the cost was too great. As the Ole Miss crisis developed in 1962, it was only right at the end, when it was clear that Governor Barnett and the federal government were headed towards a fatal confrontation. It was only right at the end that business leaders gathered in Jackson in a vain effort to persuade the governor to back down. In Alabama, it was only the violence of Bull Connor's police and the mob against the Freedom Riders that prompted the business community to start to mobilize to change the city government. Even then, they could not prevent Connor's disastrous tactics in 1963. In South Carolina, it took the example of Ole Miss to build peace support for the peaceful desegregation of Clemson University. Rabble-rousers wanted Fritz Hollings to head a motorcade to Oxford, Mississippi, in support of Governor Barnett. Instead, he sent his state law enforcement chief to Mississippi to learn how that sort of crisis could be avoided. And it was after that that Hollings warned South Carolina that they had run out of courts and that there would be no outside investment at all in the state if there was any violence at Clemson. White Southern politicians often express contradictory recollections about what they said and did in the 1950s. Sometimes they say they did not mean it when they talked about the danger of race war and manning the barricades, that they were only going through the motions in order to satisfy their racist constituents. At other times, same people expressed disbelief that they had actually said the things that they said back then. The first account is linked to what I have described as the self-exculpatory explanation of the racial crisis of the 1950s. That is, it was the fault of everybody except the leaders themselves. The fault of demagogues, the fault of the Brown decision, the fault of the courts, the fault of the federal government, the fault of African Americans. Linked is the self-congratulatory account, especially in states like South Carolina, North Carolina, and Arkansas, or Tennessee rather, that they avoided the violence that racked other states. I would simply note that massive resistance was a top-down strategy. It wasn't one of leaders being coerced into resistance. As for self-congratulation, leaders like Fritz Hollings did take their followers away from the brink of the abyss. But who led them to that brink in the first place? The crisis over the Brown decision was largely a crisis within the white community. African Americans were only the tokens whose future the white leaders and the courts were deciding. Whites still believed they were dictating the timetable of racial change. But by 1960, it was clear that the first post-war system of biracial politics had yielded few positive results for African Americans. And it was this lack of progress that provoked African American students to take matters into their own hands. It was their direct action protests to desegregate the public spaces of the South, bus terminals, department stores, restaurants, places of entertainment. It was that provoked a violent white backlash that in turn forced Southern businessmen and the federal government to intervene. John Kennedy, who had had so much faith in Southern moderates, was forced by Southern intransigence not only to send troops into the South, but to introduce coercive legislation. It would fall to a Southern white liberal, his successor Lyndon Johnson, to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and responding to another crisis created by black direct action and white violent response at Selma, to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Southern liberal politicians had to respond now to a situation where, for the first time, African Americans dictated the timetable of racial change. Southern liberals were largely bystanders in the legislative deliberations of 1964 and 1965. How they would respond to a system of biracial politics in which large numbers of African Americans voted will be my subject of the last lecture, tomorrow night. Thank you very much.
So I just wanted to make, thank you, that was really good, and I'm glad you disagreed with Michael Klarman. But I do have a couple of points I wanted to make. So the first point has to do with this equalization. The equalization strategy is first begun by Charles Houston and the NAACP at the state university levels, and they're very strategic about arguing we've got to take this to the courts. As I said yesterday, they recognized that there was something different. You know, the trajectory was changing. It might not have been as changing as fast as they wanted, but they did recognize it. So from the 1930s with Maryland, and it just kept going through, they argued this separate, we want you to make it separate but equal. And they realized that those states couldn't do it. So it's not till 1951 with Sweat v. Painter that they stopped that argument. And they go to the argument of, no, separate can't be equal. And so the University of Texas is forced to open its law school. Well, by the time these Southerners figure out, oh, equalization is good, the courts have already undermined that argument. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing, though, that I wanted to say is that in the 1940s, especially prior to Brown, northern schools are taking cases to court and desegregating. There's a Hedgepeth case in Trenton, New Jersey. There's one in Clare, New Jersey. There's cases all in these northern states that are really making the pre-Brown arguments. So the courts are already inclined, both at the lower court levels. By the time they get to 1954, it is just a different world for these Southerners. And what I find fascinating is, well, I find two things fascinating. One thing I find fascinating is that there are these important judges from the South, Judge Tuttle, Judge Minor Wisdom, who are brave, I hope. I mean, it would be interesting, but they seem to be brave. Jack Bass's book, Unlike the Heroes. Okay, but
guy in Alabama, Frank Johnson.
Frank Johnson.
Yeah, Unlike the Heroes. Okay, but then so the court. So I just really want to emphasize the role of the courts, and the other thing I want to emphasize in relation to the role of the courts is this. So Truman. His executive order is what desegregated the troops, even before the actual war took place in Korea. So I'm curious as to whether these GIs are the product of a 1948 post, or are they before that? Because by 1948, it's Truman who has desegregated through executive order. But the final thing I want to make, and this is it, is that what I find so fascinating between yesterday's argument, when the federal government was to some degree capitulating to these Southerners, by the 1950s and 60s, the federal government, as you say, is not, they're on this collision course, and one of the major reasons for the collision course is the Cold War. And so for the first time, again, back to the courts, the United States government is taking a side in this issue, first with Shelley v. Kramer, and then with Brown v. Board. So you really do have a situation where the federal government, and I think it's really important to, again, to see how the federal government is working through the courts. Even though it's not working as fast as we'd like, there is a movement, there's a motion that you can just see the South is going to lose.
I would agree, but what strikes me as fascinating, and it links both the Cold War and the equalization question, is that here in South Carolina you have Jimmy Burns, been at the highest levels of political strategizing in Washington, been on the Supreme Court, knew the Supreme Court judges, was in a lot of contact with them, had been Secretary of State at the start of the Cold War. No one was better placed to understand what was happening. And yet he genuinely believed that his school equalization strategy in South Carolina, in which he invested an enormous amount of political capital, that was going to be enough. I mean, that it was going to satisfy both African Americans, which was highly implausible, and secondly, that it was going to satisfy, second, that it was going to satisfy the courts, and third, that it was going to satisfy the federal government. You know, no one was better placed to lead the South into a different direction than Jimmy Burns, and he didn't do it. Years later, he's furious. He has an African-American driver, and in one of those classic stories about driving around the South, they stop at a petrol station, a Phillips station, somewhere in South Carolina, and this is after '64, and the local garage petrol station owner won't let the African-American driver use the toilet. And Burns is furious. And he gets onto the head of Phillips and says, you know, why, et cetera, et cetera. And the head of Phillips says, well, it was just what they're doing at the local level, can't do anything about that.
But this is after the act?
After the act.
Because again, and this is, I mean, I don't know why the Republicans get the role of the courts so well today, and you know, many of us don't get the role of the courts as well. But historically, I mean, again, there are killings, Vernon Dahmer in Mississippi, over voting rights, there are killings, all that stuff, horrible stuff is happening. But the courts, Heart of Atlanta, all these cases, they are ruling. I mean, the pendulum is definitely moving in the side of desegregation.
And of course, they're Republican judges. I mean, the Democrats appointed these appalling judges that came back to what haunted them in the 1960s. But Tuttle and Wisdom, Frank Johnson, Richard Reeves are different, but Tuttle and Wisdom both very much Republicans. And I think the other side of it is that, as you say, the federal government's moving in this direction, but the Eisenhower administration is extremely cautious. It gives up so much stuff, or Eisenhower himself gives up so much stuff. 1957 Civil Rights Act, they give up that power to intervene in school desegregation cases almost casually. And Lyndon Johnson can't believe his luck when they do it. And that partly comes down because Eisenhower never really, I mean, he would send the troops into Little Rock, but he really didn't understand the court decision, didn't like it, and was deeply sympathetic to people like Jimmy Burns.
In fact, he said that his appointment of Earl Warren was the biggest mistake he made as president, I believe. I'm paraphrasing here. But Evelyn, I would just ask you about, with all deliberate speed, because though you're right, the court, and it wasn't the impetus of the court itself, it was Charles Hamilton Houston and his cadre of geniuses who were pushing. But the court could give and the court could take away, right?
The court could give, I know, but I think this is the strategy that it's important to recognize, that this isn't a smooth and quick ride, okay?
Sure.
It's slow, it's got setbacks, but you're moving in a direction where the arc of the universe is kind of moving toward justice. Yes. The reason I'm so uptight about this is where I see the court going today.
Right. Well, but Tony, I wanted to go back to, who was making the argument that you were quoting at the beginning? Klarman? Who was making the argument?
Michael Klarman, that there's a backlash to Brown.
Our colleague here at the law school. Now, but the reason Reconstruction fell apart, or one principal reason, was everyone was astonished that 80% of the eligible black men in the South actually registered and voted in 1867 and 1860. Nobody could believe it. I mean, it was such a shock. Even people in the North who were quote unquote liberals realized these Negroes could vote and actually run a state like South Carolina. I mean, imagine, we forget how black the South was. It wasn't only called the Black Belt because of the soil. It was black. And it's amazing to think of what the implications could have been had there been equal schools and a good public system, which black Reconstruction governments were the first to advocate for in the first place, I mean, system-wide. And then, yeah, in the South, and then if black men, because remember women couldn't vote, had continued to vote, it would have been revolutionary. And my thesis is not only was it too much for the South, which it was, and there was immediate violence, and the Ku Klux Klan started a year before, in 1866, but it was too much for the North. They could not, it was like, okay, we freed these people, but this is out of hand. So how could Klarman make that argument when it was precisely black people voting that led to the dismantlement of Reconstruction in the first place?
To be fair to Michael, I think he would place less emphasis on the fact of that necessarily voting rights was, well, no, I take it. He did really think that they should have stayed on that route. But it was really the other argument that schools were such an explosive issue, and that there was, historically, that there was this backlash after Brown.
Can I just say real quickly, you go with a winning strategy. So the winning strategy was the school strategy. At the higher levels.
The winning strategy in the courts was the schools,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, well, this is Clarence argument.
Right.
So the winning strategy, I mean, they had won Smith v. Allwright, but there's a book by Zeldin about the ballot. That fight for the vote in Texas for every single, they had a lot of cases before they even got to Smith v. Allwright. But the catch for the courts is that you could see they were winning and making really good progress about this school situation. So you just go for the jugular, which
Sure.
they did.
Right.
And Hannah Arendt thought that always thought that it was miscegenation laws that really needed to be challenged. Well, I mean,
What?
I
That's
think
ridiculous.
Brandon writes
yeah,
about that.
if you're talking about backlash, then that would have been the one.
Well, there was a relationship between school desegregation and the potential for miscegenation. I used to think schools in my little county in West Virginia integrated in 1955, a year after Brown, which is extraordinary. Even in the rest of West Virginia, there were counties that didn't desegregate till 20 years later. Yeah. And then a couple years later, they integrated the public swimming pool in my little town. And I used to think, why is it such a big deal? And then when I got older, I realized it's proximity, which is sexuality. It was related to miscegenation in the first place, along with the potential for equal education, blah, blah, blah. But I think that the driving emotional thing was interracial sex. And but would you agree with that, Professor Badger or Professor Higham?
Can I just
Yeah.
tell weren't you the one that told me at school you had to dance with boys?
Yes. At school, which I went to what would be called an art school, in effect, we had operettas and dancing, and every 6 weeks we had a public performance. And remember, it's just a tiny group of black kids in my school. We could not dance with someone from the opposite race, so that meant that it would be two boys dancing. They would let a white boy and a black boy dance. And if there were no white boys available, then it would be two black boys would have to. And I never thought of the irony of that encouragement of homoerotic relationships till right now. But I swear to God, that was the truth. You could dance across the color line within the same gender. That's totally bizarre, but it was true. Yeah. Anyway, Tony, I think there was a question there. I'm not sure. Professor West. Bruce.
I'm pretty loud.
It's because we're recording.
So thank you, Tony. The lecture was as elegant as it was informative. I kind of detected in it, though, two different meanings of why Southern white liberals fail, and really two different historical arguments. In sort of the first and the third acts of the lecture, the failing was an active failure on the part of the Southern white liberals. that is a failure of vision, a lack of a coherent strategy, a failure of courage. That is, you seem to say they could have done better and they didn't. In the middle part, the second act of the lecture, where you sort of laid out the backlash that was underway well before Brown and all the structural constraints that the moderates faced and how little power they had, you seem to be saying that they were failing in a more passive sense of the term, that no matter what they did, they couldn't have won in that situation, that the constraints were so great. And I'm wondering if we force you to choose between those two explanations, wasn't there an active failure on that part? Was there a strategy they could have pursued that really would have made a positive difference in promoting racial change? Or were they, as some of them said in the end, sort of victims of a situation that was too overwhelming?
I mean, like any good Southern politician, I like to have the privilege of having both views. But I think my argument would be this, that I'm not saying that it would have been easy. I once asked Frank Smith, how could you have sorted the matter out in Mississippi? And he said, well, he always thought that you could have got, if the governor had got the business leaders in Mississippi from all over the state and the newspaper editors from all over the state to a meeting in Jackson, then, they could have, from the top down, had some sort of policy of at least token compliance with the court. And then you looked at Mississippi and you thought, well, in a sense, that's what they did do. And it didn't happen. I mean, they got all these people together and there was no meeting of minds. So I agree that there's that problem. But if you go round the rest of the South, I mean, it's difficult. In Alabama, 2 senators, John Sparkman and Lister Hill, virtually the whole Alabama congressional delegation, the governor of the state, Jim Folsom, they're all liberals. They all have racial views that are relatively enlightened. And yet, they passed the Boswell Amendment to the Constitution, really trying to reinforce the white primary. Alabama is a Dixiecrat state in 1948. And of course, Sparkman and Hill really do run for cover as soon as the issue hops up in 1954. And part of me feels, well, surely there was potential there. It's a TVA state. Surely there was a potential there for a more constructive policy. And you look at Tennessee and North Carolina, I mean, they're not great examples, but I mean, they do go down the token compliance route, and they do it. And of course, and what they discover in token compliance is the best way of maintaining maximum segregation in the South was to go down the token compliance route. There were far fewer children at integrated schools in North Carolina in the late 1960s than there were in Mississippi, because token compliance was actually the cunning, the smart segregation strategy. But it would have avoided these horrendous clashes in the 50s. And
what constituted token compliance again?
A small number of African Americans going to schools in urban areas, relatively, like Charlotte and Greensboro. Indeed, the idea was Little Rock. After all, in Arkansas, they desegregated the schools in Hoxie. Dale Bumpers persuaded his school board in Charleston, Arkansas, to desegregate the day after the Brown decision. And the deal was, you have desegregation there. That means in the Black Belt, nothing happens. And so the Black Belt politicians aren't worried because nothing's happening in there. So they'll allow that token compliance to go on in the Piedmont. The problem will come later. I mean, the problem will come in the mid-1960s when Jesse Helms and George Wallace will point out to the people in the Black Belt, this deal didn't last, and racial change is going to come now.
But what argument did he use to persuade people the day after Brown to desegregate?
Small number of African American children, very expensive segregation system. Having to bus African American children a long way to get to a school. cost the county a lot of things, and a moral issue. You know. I mean, there were moral white Southerners.
It does still seem, though, doesn't it, that for even the most
Bruce,
liberal white Southerner, it does still seem that for even the most liberal white Southerners at the time, the maintenance of legal segregation in some form was something that they just couldn't give up, whereas for African-American Southerners, an end to segregation was the bottom line, was also something that they couldn't give up, so that maybe there was no real middle ground.
I think one of the things for those whites is there was a difference between the people who in theory thought that segregation, you know, was probably indefensible, which could be for the Cold War, it could be for reasons of religious belief, it could be philosophical reasons. They could see that. They could believe that. Didn't mean you necessarily needed to do something about it today. We all do that. And the privileges of whiteness for you know are such that, you know, it's an act of self-sacrifice to just give that up willy-nilly. Now,
Per capita school child, you know, expense for white schools and black schools, which is, the gap was huge.
and that's why equalization was never going to, in the end, they weren't going to get it. I mean, the Mississippi State Legislature, for example, wasn't going to vote the sorts of sums of money that would have equalized the school system. I mean, they couldn't conceive of that.
So in your book, do you go into detail about the exceptional cases, such as the example you just gave, which desegregated immediately or reasonably, quickly?
Not in great detail, but I mean, what's surprising about it is that unless outsiders came in and you know, Life magazine started taking photographs, which happened at Hoxie, no one paid much attention. And that was a frightening thing in Arkansas. The frightening thing with Forbes was that that he knew that. I mean, it was part of his political DNA in many ways, and Forbes wasn't invested in racial segregation as a sort of a means of political survival. But what he saw when outsiders went into Hoxie, like Jim Johnson, and started stirring things up on the segregation issue, then Forbes started to worry. And it became a circular argument. He would go along to people like Brooks Hayes and James Trimble and say, you sign the Southern Manifesto because otherwise these Ku Kluxers are going to go wild.
Right.
And then he would turn around and say, well, I've got to do this because we've got all these terrible people. And look, even the moderates signed the Southern Manifesto. But what the supreme irony of it all is Jim Johnson. Here we have this man in the mid-1950s advocating defiance of the Supreme Court, deliberately creating in the Little Rock crisis rumors of mobs from the Black Belt, armed mobs from the Black Belt in Arkansas convening on Little Rock. And they phone up Forbes to tell them that I see all these armed people are coming up to the Capitol, armed, you know, Citizens Council people. And, you know, and so there's all this going on. And who is Jim Johnson? What does he do later? Who's one of the leaders in the impeachment drive against Bill Clinton?
Right.
It's Jim Johnson. And that coterie in Arkansas.
Evelyn said the same guy spotted the caravan coming up to the border. Yeah, who's the next? Oh, yes, go ahead.
Thank you for that talk. Can you hear me? Oh, okay. So I just wanted to follow up a little bit on Bilbo. This is relevant for today, what's going on today. He also believed that African Americans should be deported to Liberia, right? So, you know, challenge to birthright citizenship and all that that we're still living in. So I just had a question in terms of, so before school integration becomes this flashpoint that reorganizes politics in the South, I'm just wondering, what role does welfare chauvinism play? Had that been a sort of field of struggle before this moment in the mid-50s? Because, you know, before, or, you know, when the New Deal first adopts Social Security, right, many African Americans aren't aren't covered, right? Because their domestics are agricultural workers. And I'm just wondering to what extent your racial liberals or your white liberals believed in a restriction of welfare rights or the welfare state when it came to sort of African American Southern constituents.
I think it's a very, very good question, because I think on the whole, they thought welfare provision ought to be more liberalised. Remember that, of course, this is when AFDC is still a pretty tiny program until the 1960s. It's the 60s that when that will start to be a real tension. I don't see much evidence that they if you look amongst Democrats generally in the 50s, I don't see, there was this sort of notion that you incrementally had to improve Social Security benefits. That was a routine part of an expansionist economic policy. The argument that these welfare provisions were destroying individual initiative and morality and the rest of it, they don't surface very much. And those governors, and you see the great thing for those governors after the war was that for the first time, Southern states were involved in these matching programs, could afford to pay their end of the bargain. And so they were keen to do that. They were in the position to do it for the first time. So it was a different discourse. It's a very good point. Very different discourse.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Again, fantastic presentation. I want to go back to the idea that economics of voting rights, rather than the Brown decision, made the difference, created the pushback by the whites, in power, especially when they were talking about trying to just like not support, the integration of the schools and things like that. But I like to take it back to the whole idea of outsiders coming in the midst of Bull Connors and the direct action, by people, including in some ways the international community when Malcolm X goes out to Oxford and start talking about human rights rather than civil rights. And we have in that historical context the Cold War going about, where you have all of this craziness going on here, and people who have returned from the wars are seeing it back, trying to get democracy in this country rather than fight back out there for democracy, so to speak. And in that context, do you think that the Cold War has anything to do with the federal administration going in and trying to get some direct action so that things stop, so that whoever says the survival of civilization that was at risk would change, at least the mentality?
There's certainly, in the State Department in the 50s and the Justice, because the Eisenhower Justice Department was far more activist on civil rights than Eisenhower was. There's a continuity between the Truman and Eisenhower Justice Departments that isn't true with the presidents. And Eisenhower was enough. And Eisenhower knew enough about the rest of the world to know what some of these things, how some of these things look like. And of course, you'll know that the USIA produced a film about Little Rock, designed to persuade the rest of the world. Isn't it wonderful? Federal government's intervening on behalf of African American school children. And of course, the thing about any USIA film, it wasn't allowed to be shown in the United States. So you could have that. And there's no doubt that quite a few of the reformers in the South had a positive view of the Cold War and international relations in general, in terms of having a direct racial impact. At that point, it's an interesting question about where it turns, because back in the 40s, on the whole, the South is a great supporter of the United Nations. But there's going to be this strand there in the South that will become the South is a supporter of free trade, and it's a supporter of internationalist organizations. And there's going to be a point in the 50s when the South becomes hostile to, some parts of the South become hostile to free trade and then become hostile to international organizations. And so you get, someone like Eastland will fall into that sort of camp, where the Brown decision is part of the international communist conspiracy led by the UN.
I have a lot more questions, but I have the pleasure of joining him for dinner. So, ladies and gentlemen, please give it up for Tony Badger for excellent. And please join us for food and drink at the back of the room.
Ooh.